Hello, and welcome to Mental Health Matters Podcast. I'm your host, Liz Lang, and I'm here with Dr. Mark Burton. In this podcast, we will talk about all things mental health. Thank you so much for joining us. Hey guys, Liz Lang here with Dr. Mark Burton. And this week, we're going to get into high desire versus low desire. So this is an important topic to talk about because I think it's something that a lot of couples run into. And I want to start off by letting our listeners know we're going to be talking about sexuality. We're going to be talking about the arousal cycle. We will keep this professional and we will keep it all clinical, but we are going to be talking about sex and we're going to be going into some details that if you're not quite ready to have this conversation with your kids, maybe don't listen to this around them.
Good advice.
Yes. But I mean, there's still a lot of good information that you're going to get. And if this is something that you are struggling with, please keep listening. And I know in a lot of Christian cultures, sexuality is very much under talked about.
Mm-hmm.
And, some of that's cultural. Some of that is, I think, generational. So, it's important that we have these conversations because sexuality is an important part of a committed relationship.
Right. Non-sexual marriages just don't do very well at all.
Yeah.
And so, the problem and difference of desire is if you look at what clinicians talk about as sexual problems, for some reason they list fertility issues as the number one, which I suppose that is a sexuality issue. I see them, differently. But the number two would be this difference in level of desire. So It's something that I think I've mentioned this on the previous episodes. Your chance of being with someone, so marrying someone who has a very similar sexual desire pattern as you is only about 10%. And so what I try and help couples understand is, 90% of the long-term committed couples at some point are dealing with this particular issue. So it is an important issue.
Mm-hmm.
And, echoing what you said, dialogue is the most important thing you can have as a couple to talk about it.
And it doesn't mean that this is going to be an issue for every couple.
No,
so
it wasn't an issue for every couple. It's an issue for many couples. So.
Because there are many couples out there who are very happy and who feel very satisfied, who have differences in desire, but they've learned to navigate it.
Yeah, that's great to say that because I forget that we should say this isn't going to be true for every person out there. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, exactly. And another thing is, you don't see this as often in newly married couples or brand new relationships because the passion is so high that oftentimes, it's that dopamine, it's those hormones that causes you to want to have a lot of sex, which is good. And I think that's a very healthy part of the relationship. But I like to call it coming out of the honeymoon cocoon, because life hits and then your desire and your sexuality, it's all going to change.
Right. And I think I've said this before also, that honeymoon, let's call it the honeymoon phase or that high passion phase of the relationship lasts anywhere from 6 months to 2 years. Mm-hmm. And then for most couples, after 2 years, it changes. And certainly with if you have children, that's going to change it.
Yeah.
Hormonally, it changes for the woman. You're both so tired, in that first year. Your attentions are elsewhere. There are all sorts of things that come into play. So you're right. Typically for most relationships, high passion at the start of the relationship and frequent sexual activity. In fact, one of the markers for me, because if a couple comes in and they're talking about sexuality, I'll ask them what it was like for them when they first got together. And it's a real red flag for me if they say, well, they never had that passion phase. Mm-hmm. The passion phase is really one of those phases that I think is really necessary for a successful long-term relationship.
Yeah. So I am curious what your experience has been like with this in terms of homosexual couples. Because I would imagine, that, among homosexual couples, do you still think it's that you only have that 10% chance? Because
I don't know if it's at 10%, but I see the same issue. It's a very similar issue. But I think it's more about individual differences as opposed to sexual identity or sexual preference. So
Right.
yeah, I saw yesterday one member of a gay couple, and they have this issue, and other couples I've seen have the same issues. So I think it's just you fall in love and you have these individual differences, but that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to each want the same amount of sex all the
Okay.
time. So I think it's very, very similar.
Okay. And so the reason I ask is because I know from in heterosexual couples, the arousal cycle is different. And oftentimes that's a big barrier when you have these difference in desires. Maybe not necessarily just the arousal cycle, but I guess men and women need different things to feel aroused or to feel like they want to be intimate. And so that's why
Right.
I wondered if that's where there could be a difference.
Well, I think you mean that because, say, if you have a gay couple, I think you're referencing that men typically are aroused easier. Is that it?
Yeah, yeah, I think
And
that's a good way to look at it.
yeah, and so I think that's true, but it doesn't necessarily mean that one partner wants to be aroused. And so
Okay.
it becomes more of a choice. I really don't want to have sex, or, there's too much sex. But I think that, as we get into what that means as far as high desire, low desire, it's complicated. I'm sure our listeners are going to realize it's
Yeah.
complicated. We're
Yeah.
going to just scratch the surface and hopefully give some information that will be helpful. But I think that I'm going to mention three different ways to look at this. First one is a book I've mentioned before. It's called Come As You Are. And this woman who wrote the book, I think her contribution to this field is really to have this idea of the gas pedal meaning high desire, or I want to be sexual, and
Mhm.
the brake meaning no, I don't want to have sex. And that for each couple, you really have to get into it. And this is where the dialogue is important because you need to know, okay, what for my spouse, what's the gas
Mhm.
pedal? What is it
Yeah.
that gets my spouse? Either you can talk about it being turned on or just in the mood to be sexual. And then, you have to equally important is to know what are the break, what are
Mhm.
the items that cause the break to go on. Now, those are going to be different for each of you. And I think, the cliche is that men always want to have sex.
Yeah.
Think for some men, that might be true. I think that changes, though, as you get into longer term relationships. And so the things that can negatively affect, say, a female sexual desire, say, the stress or maybe you're arguing, are going to be the same things that are going to negatively affect a male's desire as well. And
Mhm.
so over the lifespan, that the desire changes. That's an important thing for couples to know that it's not going to be constant over
Right.
the lifespan for both.
Right.
If we're talking about a heterosexual marriage, for both the female and the male, it's not going to change. And often what's typical is often for men, the desire starts to decrease. A lot of
Mhm.
people think it's about hormones. I have another idea though about that I'll bring out. And for women, often sexual desire goes up. Now, one thing I've heard about what's the reason for that is so many things change. The stress level goes down. Kids are
Yep.
probably out of the home. There's no fear or worry about getting pregnant. And so it frees women up to be more sexual and free.
Mhm.
And so it's almost like, we're passing, the men are going down, the women are going up,
Right.
which is pretty common. But I think what happens with men often is erectile dysfunction issues.
Mhm. Yes.
And, culturally speaking, one of the ways somehow that we define masculinity is how hard can my penis get,
Right.
And so if I'm having trouble with erectile dysfunction, I've seen these men, a lot of men, instead of dealing with it, and there's a shame element too.
Mhm.
These men feel shame somehow that they can't get an erection or maintain an erection. And so rather than deal with it in what I'd call a more mature, loving way, what they do is they turn off. They just say,
They
I
shut
don't want to
down.
have sex. Yeah, they shut down. And which, as the couples get older, is very perplexing to their spouses. So it's important to deal with all those issues.
And I think a reason why dysfunction can be so hard and disheartening in a marriage is when a man chooses to say, just instead of dealing with it, just push it away. From the female or from your partner, that can often feel like a rejection.
Yes,
And that's
exactly.
and that makes it really hard. And so I think one of the things that I want to talk about is changing the narrative from rejection to the timing is wrong.
Hmm.
Because no matter, even if you are in that 10% of you have the same desire level, you're still not always going to be 100% in sync sexually. I
Right,
don't think that couple exists.
right.
And so I think it's important to learn how to kindly say no, or I guess it's important to learn how to say no softly, to give a soft no, but it's also just as important to learn how to hear no.
Right. But I think that one thing that can work for couples, may not work for all couples, is if you're going to say no to, say, a request from your partner to be sexual,
Hmm.
I think it's important to reschedule,
Yeah.
to give an option. Well, not right now, but, maybe tomorrow or, so it's not a blanket no, which would feel like a rejection for many
Yeah.
people, certainly. But if it's more not right now, and I think to offer, say, a reason or a rationale. I'm
Yeah.
I'm not feeling well, or I'm really tired, or I'm stressed about this thing at work, or and then offer an alternative. I think also that if you're wanting some sort of connection, because often sexuality, especially in long-term marriages, is really, it's certainly about the sex, but I think it shifts to be mostly about the emotional connection. And
Hmm.
so you can do that. So you can say, well, I'm not really ready or in a place to be able to be sexual with you, but let's sit down and, somehow connect emotionally. And
Yeah.
so if you were to say no and then, you both go your separate ways, that's really going to feel like rejection.
Hmm.
If you say no, let's come together in a different way. Let's sit down and talk, or, something, go sit outside. That doesn't feel so much like a rejection because it says, I still want to be with you. I'm just not ready to do it in this way.
Yeah. And I think that's important. And so that's why I wanted to talk about changing that narrative, because
Hmm.
rejection hurts and rejection is hard. But if you can change it to the timing is wrong or this isn't the
Right.
right time for me, it's a completely different story.
Yeah. And so, one of our recent episodes was all about changing narrative. We have
Yeah.
control over our narratives. And so you can hear a couple of different narratives that I often hear. And typically they're from females in the relationship. It's this narrative, oh, my husband always wants sex. He just likes me to have sex. Now, there are other things that come into that we'll talk about, meaning you've got to have a really healthy emotional relationship anyway in order
Hmm.
to have a good physical relationship. But I think that what I've tried to help females understand, in our culture, men, I really believe, want to be emotionally close. And one of the only ways they know how to do that is to have sex and then have an orgasm with their partner.
Yeah.
And almost universally afterwards, the husbands will say, well, that's when I feel really close.
Hmm.
So one of the ways to change the narrative is to say he wants to be close to me.
Yeah.
And this goes back to what I said a few minutes ago. You may not want to have sex. Let's figure out a way to be close.
Hmm.
Also, it's really important for men to understand they can learn how to be close emotionally in other ways, not just sex.
Yes. To
And
have
so it all fits together. You've got to be able to have that emotionally close relationship without sex.
Yeah, you've got to be able to find a way to connect outside of sex. And
Right.
again, it's not that that sexual connection isn't important, because it is. But I mean, if that's the only way you're connecting emotionally, that's kind of a problem. And one of the things that Curtis and I have done that's really helped us to connect is we'll say something like, can we just chat? And when one of us says, I want to chat, and oftentimes we'll do this like if when we're going on a little bit of a longer drive or a long drive, that we know, okay, that means our phones are going to go away. Oftentimes we both like listening to things, or we like doing things while we're driving. And so
Yeah.
if one of us says, "Hey, can we chat?" or "Let's chat," there's nothing in particular that we necessarily want to talk about. We just want to talk to each other, and the phones go away and we focus on each other.
Mhm.
And it's an intimate, and it feels very intimate, right? And it feels very bonding. And maybe it's not going to look like that for every couple, but find something that can give you that emotional connection, right? John
Right.
Gottman talks a lot about, and I also think so does William Doherty,
Mhm.
talks about rituals of connection.
Right.
And, those are important in a long-term committed relationship because they're going to bring you that emotional intimacy. And if you have good emotional intimacy, you're going to have better dialogue. And if you're able to have really good dialogue about sexuality, it's going to be a lot better. It's going to get better. And
Right.
so I know that that's a common thing for couples to struggle with. And we talked about this idea before of why it can be hard for couples to talk about sex. And so when it comes down to it, you just have to do it, I guess. Like you just have to talk about it. And so this idea of couples struggling to talk about sex, I mean, it feels a little weird to me because I'm like, I mean, you're seeing each other naked. How much more vulnerable can you get? So,
Right. Right. It's just that what turns us on, what we find erotic, is intensely personal for
yes.
each of us. And so this idea of if we talk about that, that somehow, we feel guilty or we're shameful. And then, as you mentioned before, in a lot of, say, religious traditions or even culturally, we aren't raised in homes where we're talking about that. And so for a lot of us, it's just we aren't used to it.
Yeah.
And the more you can do it, the easier it is. You brought up John Gottman, and so I think this is a good time to bring up two competing views on high desire, low desire. So I'll start first, though, with Ester Perel, who is a female psychotherapist out of New York. She's a Belgian woman. And she wrote a book called Mating in Captivity. And a lot of people really misunderstood that book, what she was saying, because some people took it to mean that she was saying having affairs is okay. And I've
Mm,
heard her speak many times, and that is definitely not what she was saying. She just has a different way of looking at the desire cycle. So she thinks there's a real contradiction in modern relationships for people, like the familiar versus the novel. We've talked about how novel
mm-hmm.
experiences are important, or the stable versus the mysterious. We want love, which is all about security and safety and stability, but we also want passion, which is more about adventure and novelty. And so
Yeah.
that you have these two competing ideas. And she thinks that being too emotionally close or intimate gets in the way of having that mystery or the
Okay.
passion.
Mm-hmm.
And so, her book is all about, or her idea. And she has a pretty popular podcast if other listeners are interested, where she talks with couples. And I think they're therapy couples who have agreed to talk to her about this. And so for her, it's more not being so emotionally connected that you destroy the mystery or the passion. So
Okay.
that's one view.
Mm-hmm.
John Gottman has an entirely different view
Yeah.
about it. And he doesn't believe that the problem is a lack of distance or mystery, but he really thinks it's a lack of deepening intimacy. And that, what he calls the intimate conversation, affection, friendship are central to the erotic life of a long-term relationship. Now, I'm going to say I really lean more towards Gottman. Here's the reason why: is Esther Perel, I know, is not a researcher. And I
Mm,
am almost 100% certain that she has not done any research into this. These are just her ideas.
mm-hmm.
Gottman, however, has done all sorts of research about this, and his research shows that couples who reported that they had good sex lives consistently mentioned two things. The first was maintaining a close and connected and trusting friendship. The second one, which is also important, was making sex a priority in their lives.
Yeah.
And so his research clearly showed that a strong emotional bond, strong friendship, and making sex a priority in your life leads to a satisfying sexual relation. I really believe that's true. But a lot of people like what Esther Perel says. I was trying to think of another book. I've lost it right now, but there are other people who have really put that out there, that intimacy kills the sexual relationship. I don't believe that's true.
Okay, I don't either.
So.
And now I also want to recognize that, I mean, I'm not a psychologist and I'm not even a therapist, but I mean, just in my own experience and with my own marriage, I don't know. I mean, you say that and I'm like, I like Gottman's idea better.
Yeah. Well, one that's backed up by research, it makes more sense
Yeah,
for me in my relationship. Maybe there's a whole different thing going on in New York City that
I don't know.
it is. I don't know. I mean, I
I
like Esther Perel. I don't want our listeners to think that
Right.
I don't like her work. I think that she has a lot of really good things to say about intimacy and about sexuality and about relationships. She's really worth listening to if listeners want to, tune into her podcast. So I think there certainly is a hormonal component, but I think in long-term relationships, what takes over, low sex drive, I think, is driven by being tired,
Mm-hmm.
being stressed, no time for self. I hear that a lot, mostly from women, because they're, even now, they're still the primary caretakers
Yep.
and ones who keep the house going. Kids, no time for the couple, or the couple. This goes to what Gottman said: the couple doesn't make time together or sexual activity a priority.
Mm-hmm.
And so, you have to have the right context. And thinking about a couple I saw this morning, and they don't have sex very often, but when we got into it, I guess they have this house that they really like, and it sounds almost like not really an attic, but an area upstairs that they turned into a master bedroom. And it sounds really
Mm-hmm.
beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
They don't have a door on the bedroom.
Oh, well, that's
So
a problem.
you think? So, so the wife is always, and they have two teenage girls. And
Oh, I
so
can see.
the wife is always worried that which I think this is true, 10 o'clock at night. I mean, that's when kids come alive. That's when,
Yes.
you don't have teenagers yet, but you will find this out
Yeah.
that when they're teenagers, 10 o'clock, you want to go to bed. They're just ramping up to come and talk to you.
Yeah.
And so I think in our relationship with our children, we really need to be aware of that. So they don't have a door. And
I'm
so I was just kind of, it boggled my mind, because I thought, can you expect to get in the mood if you're always worried that one of your children is going to walk in? That's a killer. That's a
yes.
desire killer right there.
Yeah. We have two doors to our room, two separate entrances to our bedroom, and we lock them. I mean,
Yeah,
like it's the only time we lock our doors.
right.
Right?
And
Hmm.
I actually think parents should lock their doors,
Yeah.
because I don't know that you want to deal with that particular issue.
No, no. Well, I mean, you really shouldn't.
No.
Anyways,
But anyway, setting the context, I think Gottman is right that I see this all the time with couples that wives want. Again, we're focusing on heterosexual relationships, but I think the
hmm
same thing can be true for gay relationships as well. What
hmm
wives want is that emotional connection first,
yes.
and then they're ready to be sexual. And men typically, again, I'm making a generalization. I know I am, but I see it every day.
Yes.
Men generally aren't very good at focusing on the emotional connection, but I really believe they can learn to be. It's not something that's inherent in all men. It's just we haven't taught men how to do that very well. And so as you're looking at low desire, high desire, and I go back to the first thing I mentioned about the gas pedal and the brake, is I am certain that for most women, one of the gas pedal things is that they want a good emotional relationship, and they want to feel close emotionally to their spouse before they engage in sexual relation.
And oftentimes, too, is men want to use sex as a stress relief.
Yeah,
And
which it is for many people.
right. But oftentimes for women, it's the opposite. If they feel stressed, they can't be in the mood, or they have no interest in it
Right,
because they're too
right,
stressed.
right.
And so I think not a lot of couples realize that. So I want to get into the arousal cycle
Mm-hmm.
of men versus women. And so The arousal cycle is, I think, something that, I mean, I hope every couple has read and understand this before they get married, because it really is different. And so my experience in school reading about the arousal cycle, I'd never seen it that way. So I'm curious how you would describe or explain the arousal cycle.
Well, I think it's definitely different for men and women, especially in the early years of the marriage. Although my experience now, I see a lot of older couples. Maybe that's just a factor of my age as well. But I see that the arousal cycle for men does change. But I
Okay.
think that men are easily aroused. And I've always thought it's the higher testosterone levels that kind of drive that. But we're aroused visually and by touch. And it's really, I've heard it put this way, this isn't too crude. You're either on or you're off. And
Oh,
you can,
yeah.
men can be, a lot of men can get an erection very quickly just by, either touching or being near their wives. And so the arousal cycle for men, the way I describe it is it's very easy, typically
Mm.
very easy, especially when we're younger and you don't have to put a lot of thought into it. One of the hard things in couples, and we're talking about after that initial passion phase,
Hmm.
I think one of the hard things for couples is that men and women don't understand each other's arousal cycle.
Yes.
And so I think for women, they don't understand how well I think they see it as being easy, but they don't get that it's very physiological.
Yeah.
And this goes back to the narrative that they have, and they go to this narrative of all my spouse wants to think about is sex, and that becomes negative for them.
Mm.
And so, to realize that we are really driven by our physiology and in many ways. And so that's especially true for men and their sexuality. And so I think to change the narrative for women that this is you married a man.
Hmm.
And if you're in a same-sex relationship with a woman, it would be very different.
Yeah.
But physiologically we are different. We aren't the same that way.
Yes.
I think for women, it's much slower. I've heard it talked about in different ways. Somebody talked about it like the gears of a car, like there are 5 gears, and you have to start in the first gear, go to
Yep.
second gear, third gear, fourth gear, fifth gear. And I used to do a little spot on a TV show, morning news on KUTV2 in Salt Lake City. And I remember this, and we were talking about sexuality. And I said to the anchor, if you want to have sex at night, you need to start in the morning.
Yep.
And I think she was shocked at that. But what I mean by that is you start, I mean, hopefully you're nice to each other and kind to each other all the time.
Hmm.
But I think being particularly attentive, more attentive, really what it's about, I think, is you're working on being more connected
Right.
throughout the day. And so for men to think that they can, come home when their wife's either been working or with the kids, they're both tired, and 10 o'clock at night they go to bed. He's ready to be sexual. For him to think that his wife is going to be ready, in the vast majority of women, that's just not going to be true because she's been dealing with all this other stuff. And I think the other important thing that I found for women in the arousal cycle, it really helps if they plan on it, if they
Yes.
know ahead of time. And in that way, mentally, they get into a different frame of mind. And I think for men, it's easy to just go from working out on your car to, okay, we're going to have sex. That's easy.
Hmm. Yes.
That is not easy for women to make that shift. And the shift is more gradual and it takes longer.
So one of the things that I think is important to talk about in the arousal cycle is men can have a full erection. I think it's like less than 10 seconds.
Mm-hmm.
In order for a woman to reach arousal, it's about 30 seconds. There's a difference there. I describe men and women as a light bulb versus a toaster oven. And it doesn't take, it's not that hard to figure out which is which. I mean, men, you flip a switch, they're ready to go. Women,
Right.
they need more buildup. And so I really appreciate what you said about, you could call it being more intentional with your
Mm-hmm.
sexuality is a really
Yeah.
good way. Because if you start, sending these subtle messages, or if you start talking about this early in the day, that build up, that anticipation, you know, that's a really great way to even just kind of spice things up, right? Or,
Right.
kind of just start talking about like, hey, I'm really looking forward to this with you tonight.
Mm-hmm.
And some people think, well, doesn't that kill the spontaneity? I mean, spontaneity is certainly good, but so
I
is
think
having sex.
spontaneity is way over rated. It's highly rated, and
Yeah.
I don't think it should be. I think it's a cultural thing that we think it should
Mm,
be spontaneous. But I really think for men, they need to understand that women, their wives, even if their wives want them sexually and a high desire, they are not going to respond in the same way that men do.
yes.
Now, as I said earlier, I think as we age, that changes a little bit and we become a little bit more equal. And I think that just for physiological reasons, again, for men, their process tends to slow down a bit.
Hmm.
And the idea of being emotionally connected typically becomes more important. I don't know that it's ever as important, but it becomes more important than it was, say, when they were younger.
Right. So another thing that I always like to bring up whenever we get into sexuality is the fact that I think it's like 60 to 70% of women, it's somewhere in there, cannot achieve orgasm without clitoral stimulation.
Right. And men need to understand that. They don't get it.
Yes. Yes.
And they take it personally. Like
Yes.
if which that has always confused me a lot. So really this is about sex education in a lot of
Yeah.
ways. I think, and a lot of couples come in to my office and they're really lacking in sex education just to be aware because again, maybe it goes back to that cultural myth of what is it that defines a man and how are you masculine and
Hmm.
you're masculine if you can bring your partner to orgasm through intercourse and
Yeah.
if you can't, then somehow that's your fault. I mean, they create a narrative. Either it's his fault, or she doesn't really want to have sex. She's not attracted to him in some way. They tend to personalize it
Hmm.
as opposed to that. That is a real thing that many women are not able to achieve orgasm through intercourse.
Yeah. And I mean, just from a physiological standpoint, if a woman is able to orgasm, she's going to want to have sex more. I mean,
That's right. I believe that.
because for men, just the act of having sex is going to get them there. And that's not the case for women. And so I think sometimes for women, it can feel like a chore because of that. It feels
Right.
like a chore because you're like, okay, I've got to get him there. But if it's going to feel like a lot less of a chore if she's joining in that physical satisfaction.
Right. But I think if men are aware that there are
Hmm.
these differences
Yes.
and they really focus on having a longer sexual experience,
Yes.
and I think a lot of men, I'll say this, men might get in trouble. I think a lot of men can be selfish
Yeah.
that way
Hmm.
around sexuality. It's just for them and, they have sex, they have an orgasm and they're done.
Yeah.
But I think that my suggestion anyway to men that I'm giving to our listeners and I give in the office is focus on her arousal first.
Yes.
That's what I would say because it's going to take a little bit longer
Hmm.
and don't get stuck in the mindset that she has to have an orgasm through intercourse
Hmm.
because it may not happen ever.
Yes. Through just
Right, through,
intercourse.
through just intercourse. That
And it has nothing to do with the man. It
has
has nothing to
nothing to
do
do
with
with.
him.
So stop personalizing this, men,
Yes.
and really focus your attention not on yourself, but on your partner. What makes it work for them, which is going to be different
Yes.
for every person. And I'm just going to mention this because I don't want to go into it too much. We've talked about porn before. I think it's one of the real drawbacks of porn
Yeah.
is that it teaches men really an inaccurate view of what sex is like. And I think that's one of the most damaging things about it is that it changes the narrative for
Yeah.
men to one that's unrealistic. That's all I'll say
Right.
about
And well, and I think because, and maybe one of the reasons why men take it so personally is because it goes back to this idea of maybe there's something wrong with my anatomy,
it.
right?
Right,
I mean, maybe my
right,
penis isn't right. That has,
right,
it has nothing, again, it has nothing to do with your anatomy. It has everything to do with her anatomy. And I also want to bring up that when a male is first sexually active, like for the very first time, he's not going to be able to hold back.
right, right.
And I think that's something that newlywed couples especially need to understand.
Mhm.
So, I mean, in that instance, you've got to be patient and you've got to be forgiving of one another while you figure this out.
Well, I've used this term before, be a sexual team. You're in this,
Yes.
you're in this together.
Yeah.
And so talking about it, and I think you've mentioned this before, talk about it before.
Yes.
For heaven's sakes. If you're in that type of culture where you're going to wait to have sex until you're married, that is such a bad idea to not
Yes.
talk about it.
Yeah.
And so, if you're engaged and you're planning on getting married, then you could certainly talk about it.
And I guess the other thing too that's probably worth bringing up is if a man is not used to holding back, it's going to be hard for him to do that at first. I think
Right.
that's another thing that couples don't understand is because, I mean, that's an important skill I think for men to learn is to hold back from orgasm, to give your partner time to get there.
Right. I agree with that, but also there are many other things that you can do that don't include intercourse. And
Yes, foreplay.
don't focus on yourself, for
Hmm.
heaven's sakes. Focus on her.
Yes. I mean, you don't underestimate foreplay because that can make a huge difference,
Right.
especially if a male has a harder time holding back. Foreplay is going to be crucial in
Yeah.
that instant.
Oh, I agree.
Yeah. Okay. This was a really great topic. Next week, we are going to get into predictors of marital satisfaction. So we're going to get into why are marriages successful and why are they sometimes not.
Right.
All right. So we will see you all next week.
Have a good week, everyone.
Have a question for Dr. Burton? How about a topic you'd like us to cover? Send us an email at mentalhealthpod21@gmail.com. This podcast was produced and edited by Liz Lang. Music is by Audio Lounge.